Human rights are the rights to which all people are entitled by virtue of being human. You don't have to do anything special to get them. Just the fact that you exist as a human entitles you to basic human rights. The United States has agreed to this. Part of the basic tenets of human rights is that they are universal. That means they exist in totality across countries, across demographics. They are universal. The United States has also agreed that they are indivisible, which means they cannot be, divided up into groups, and, you can be refused some human rights and afforded others. They're indivisible. They are interrelated. That means your basic human rights, those rights that you are entitled to just based on the fact that you are a person, they're related to each other. And all of your rights depend on each other. Basically, if you're being denied one of these human rights, you are being denied multiple of these human rights. The agreement that the United States has signed says that your human rights must be treated in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing, and with the same emphasis. Another interesting piece of information is that in the United States Customs and Immigration Service lesson plan on human rights, they mention that these basic human rights can be traced to antiquity, which means to like old times. They mention the Ten Commandments, the Code of Hammurabi, and the rights of Athenian citizens. So those are ancient historical documents that gave human rights to citizens. Human rights are enforced in international law, and some of these ancient religious and then also ancient secular writings, secular means worldly or non-religious, have historically recognized that there is, an international law or an international code that all countries are kind of bound by, or all civilizations are bound by. There have been throughout time detailed agreements, treaties, alliances. Some of them that are referenced are alliances between the Jews and the Romans, and the Syrians and the Spartans. So basically, this document that is on the United States Customs and Immigration Services website as a lesson for their employees in human rights acknowledges that not only does the United States acknowledge human rights, that the United States agrees to afford people human rights, and that the United States acknowledges that human rights have a long-standing history across civilizations, both religious and non-religious. Then this document goes into what are the bodies of international law that the United States has to follow. It talks about treaties, customary international law, and then declarations and resolutions, which are usually, agreements between countries that aren't quite to the level of treaties. And they also are made by intergovernmental bodies. So like the United Nations or NATO, just kind of different bodies around the world that multiple governments participate. Now, they do say that those declarations and resolutions are non-binding, which according to United States law, they wouldn't be, because United States law, the only binding law is the Constitution, treaties, federal statutes, and then federal regulations, and then state constitutions, state statutes, and state regulations. So those are the formally acknowledged sources of law in the United States. It then goes on to talk about on page 11, section 4, it talks about how international law, the relevance to the United States is that human rights law can be applied to immigration law broadly and like all immigration related matters, but specifically the primary application of international human rights law is in protection cases, which is namely asylum and refugee cases. So if you are questioning the deportation of the Venezuelan immigrants to the El Salvadorian prison, many of those Venezuelan immigrants were here as lawful asylum seekers because they currently have a very brutal dictatorship in place in Venezuela. So specifically, the United States Customs and Immigration Service acknowledges that these human rights laws specifically should be applied to the cases of these Venezuelans that were deported, and they were not. The human rights, international human rights, were not applied in these cases. If you then look at page 13, section 5, it talks about the different human rights that are acknowledged, and it's in an international Bill of Rights. And it specifically calls out individual security, which is protection against murder, massacre, torture, and rape. What do you think is going to happen in the most violent El Salvadorian prison? Talks about due process rights consistent with the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States. So protecting individuals against abuses of the legal system, such as being imprisoned without trial, being tried without a jury, and being subject to excessive punishment. Liberty rights consistent with the 1st and 4th Amendments in the United States Constitution. So being free to, have your own beliefs, express your own beliefs, your religion, having freedom of movement, freedom to assemble, and freedom of association. It is being reported that many of the Venezuelan immigrants were deported based on a certain tattoo they had, which turns out it was a tattoo of a soccer team, Real Madrid, I think. Also, political rights, which is protecting an individual's liberty to participate in politics, including communicating, protesting, voting, and serving in political office. Recognizing equality rights, which protects equal citizenship, being equal in the eyes of the law, and not being subject to discrimination. And social rights, so protecting the right to access to education for all citizens, knowing that education is a prevention tool for severe poverty and starvation. That is the Universal Bill of Human Rights. That is what the United States government agreed to, that based on your existence as a human being, you have a right to those things. So, read the reports, read the news releases, and I guess decide for yourself whether or not you think that the individuals rounded up and deported to a country not of their origin, and then some of whom were women who were then deported to Venezuela, back to a country where they had fled to the United States and lawfully started the process of seeking asylum to be free from political persecution in their home country under a violent dictatorship. You read through it and decide if you think that the United States of America afforded them their basic human rights. If you view the table starting on the bottom of page 16 of this lesson plan, it's called the International Human Rights Matrix. So it lists the human rights that basically the countries that adopted this declaration believe that all humans have, just based on being human. The first one is the right to seek asylum, and the category that it's been placed under is due process. So that means the United States, being party to this agreement, agrees that individuals who come here seeking asylum should be afforded some level of due process, which our asylum and refugee program offers. They apply, they have hearings, and then they're either granted asylum or not. They have a right to have access to the courts and the legal system. That also is listed as a due process right. The right not to be arbitrarily deprived of life. That's an individual right. The right not to be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. That is listed as an individual right. The right not to be held in servitude or slavery. That's an individual right. They have the right not to be imprisoned merely on the grounds of inability to fulfill a contract. That's a due process right. That means they get hearings. They get some kind of legal process to determine their liability. They have the right not to be convicted of an offense on the account of an act or omission which did not constitute a criminal offense. So they have the right not to be charged with a crime or to be convicted of a crime or treated as a criminal for infractions that are not criminal. They have the right to be recognized as a person before the law. They have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which means they have the right to either adopt or not adopt a religion, to be free to adopt a religion of their choice. They have the right not to be subject to coercion that would impair their freedom to engage or to not engage in the religion of their choice. They have due process rights to be protected against arrest or detention that's arbitrary, and any deprivation of their liberty which means their freedom to move about, to be free from detention, to be free from custody. Those are all listed as due process rights. So before their liberty can be restricted, they have a right to due process. At the time of an arrest, they have the right to be informed of the reasons and to be promptly informed of charges. That is also listed as a due process right. They have the right, as a person arrested on criminal charges, to be promptly brought before an official who is authorized by the law to exercise judicial power. They also are entitled to have a trial within a reasonable amount of time. That is also listed as a due process right. And they also, as anyone deprived of liberty by arrest, detention, or custody, they have the right to have proceedings before a court, to have a court decide on the lawfulness of their detention and on the decision as to whether or not they can be released and the conditions of release, or to be released if the detention is unlawful. That also is a due process right. They have the right to be treated with dignity and respect when they are deprived of their liberty. That's an individual right. And then individuals who are accused, which means they have not been tried and convicted yet, have the right to be separated from people who have been convicted of crimes. That also is a due process right. They have the right to a fair public hearing by a competent, independent, impartial tribunal that is established under the law. That's a due process right. They have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. That's a due process right. When they are charged with a crime, they have the right to be clearly informed of what the charges are, to have time to prepare a defense, to be tried without undue delay, to be present at their trial, to defend themselves, to have legal counsel, to be able to examine their witnesses or confront their witnesses, and to have the free assistance of an interpreter if they need one. And they have the right to not be compelled to testify against oneself. Those are also due process rights. They have the right to review for their convictions. So they have the right to appeal. That's a due process right. And they also have the right to be free from trial or punishment for an offense for which they've already been convicted or acquitted. So they also have double jeopardy protections. That is a due process right. In order to make the deportation of these Venezuelan immigrants appear to be legal, Donald Trump had to enact a 200-year-old law. That is highly likely that the conditions for the appropriate use of that law have not been met. And then they rounded up these immigrants with very little time, no charges, no information to their family, no opportunity to hear the charges, prepare a defense, no due process, and then sent them, whether or not they are criminals, whether or not they've been criminally charged, whether or not they had a legal, lawful status, sent them to a notoriously violent, dangerous prison in El Salvador where there's little to no contact with the outside world. Their family may not even be able to know what's happening to them. Regardless of whether the invokement of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was appropriate, constitutional, the method in which these individuals were treated was a violation of their human rights on multiple grounds. Those of you who think the whole immigration situation, either doesn't impact you or it's not a big deal, or maybe you're, one of the probably thousands of people who are cheering these mass deportations and cheering the roundup of people who are here seeking refuge or asylum, people who are here in an undocumented status. You may think that this doesn't affect you, but the human rights that we afford to guests in our country, we should be affording them based on this agreement that we signed. Because all of the other countries that entered into that agreement, they agreed to treat Americans who are guests and visitors in their country with these same rights. So if we are not living up to the expectations of this agreement for people from other countries when they are in the US, And if you've been watching the news, there's been at least one German, one Canadian, and one citizen of the United Kingdom who have been unhumanely detained by our Immigration and Customs Agency. I guess if you're happy with the way this has been going, I wouldn't plan on doing any international travel. Welcome to the new America where there are no due process rights. And as of like yesterday, I believe law firms are being extorted from the Oval Office.